The situation in the Ukrainian city of Pokrovsk is looking increasingly critical, but is the fault for this situation lie firmly not at Putin's feet, but at Ukrainian high commands? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about the increasingly dire situation in Pokrovsk. So, Ukrainian troops are nearly cut off as the Pokrovsk defense strategy fails. This is unusually sharp language from Euromaidan Press, a news outlet that is very much pro-Ukraine. And I want to point out that, in the Western democratic tradition, you could support a country, and that means that when they are making a huge mistake, you can criticize them. And that's probably what we're going to end up doing in this video if we're honest with ourselves. So the updated map shows that Pokrovsk is increasingly looking cut off from Russian, or really the Ukrainian forces in defense of the Pokrovsk and Mirnohad area look increasingly cut off by Russian advances. You can see here that according to Deep State, which is likely a little bit behind the times, the Russians are working tirelessly to use infiltration tactics to push sort of the front line into this kind of encircled area, right? And you can very much see that the maximum closeness of Russian forces on either side is literally just 2 kilometers. There's actually a lot of reporting that the Russian forces have actually planted flags. Now, again, this doesn't mean that an area is fully occupied, but it means that Russian forces are operating as far north as the northwestern apex of the city. And this is a dire situation because remember, you have not just Ukrainian forces operating in Pokrovsk, but also in places like Mirnohad. But it doesn't matter if this area is under control if there's no logistical route to withdraw these troops. And you can see that this small way, this small narrow path is, well, pretty tough for Ukraine to conduct a withdrawal operation. Now, the danger is that because the fighting in Pokrovsk is so heavy that Ukraine has deployed actually a lot of their best troops into this infantry, into this area. And the danger is that the forces here are not going to be able to easily conduct a withdrawal, right? Because you might recall that the encircle and annihilate tactic is something that Russia has been using as a staple for literally the last 3 years. It's the way that they seize these kind of targets. But 2 years ago, right, if you were in danger of encirclement, you could conduct a fighting withdrawal, right? With it wasn't easy, but it was possible, right? A relatively narrow passageway like this one here, 2 kilometers wide, could withdraw a fair number of troops, right? Even if they were under artillery fire. That is not the case anymore. You have to think that 2 kilometers, guys, if you're a drone pilot and you fly a Mavic in somewhere like Pershi Trinia, and you're just sort of flying it, you can literally watch. They could probably watch across the pincer movement another drone, another reconnaissance drone. The Russians will have almost total air dominance here and total reconnaissance. And so you combine that with the ability to rapidly deploy FPV drones. Because remember, if you're close to the front, look, let's say, again, if you're willing to run a reconnaissance drone here in like Zverova, if you're willing to run a reconnaissance drone here, you can operate an FPV strike team too. So you're talking about tens of minutes. If you spot Ukrainian troops conducting a withdrawal, you can have FPV drones striking them in literally 10 or 15 minutes. And the fact that thousands potentially of troops have to withdraw through these lines is itself disturbing. And it simply isn't the same tactical reality as this exact map would be 2 years ago, right? Now, the Ukrainians say this isn't actually that bad. This isn't really a crisis. These troops aren't cut off yet. And there's speculation that, again, the Russian advance is not like what we saw in places like Avdiivka, right? Where it's armored troops. These are infiltration squads. And squad is even being generous. They are 1 or 2 man teams. That is the fighting. And think of it, the Russian tactic looks less and less like a wolf pack hunting across a step and looks more like the way ants get into your house. You see one ant, you see two ants, you know there's more, right? But where do they enter? Well, they enter through anywhere, any crack, any open door, any little window that's not sealed just right, and bugs can slip in ones and twos. And that's the strategy for the Russian infiltration teams. And so it's possible that the Ukrainians may be able to try to exfil using the same tactic. But literally, Sternenko, one of the sort of most prominent Ukrainian mill bloggers, came out and said what we're saying here. He said, listen, the Ukrainians once again had to conduct these messy retreats out of Avdiivka, out of Volodar, out of Sudza, and asked how yet another Ukrainian force could find itself, quote, in a fire sack. He continues to, quote, every time our forces withdraw at the last moment with heavy losses, abandoning property and equipment, not everyone could get out. Some remain in their positions forever. This is happening right now, right? And reportedly more than 100,000 Russian troops are operating in Pokrovsk and have been trying for more than a year to advance on to Pokrovsk. The Euromain press is arguing that this is a reflection of a failure of what they call the city defense strategy. And before we break that down and where I place the fault, I want to mention that if you want to help these guys out, and not just this fighting in Pokrovsk, which, by the way, those of you that donated to the previous fundraiser, if you follow Ukraine Aid Ops on X, you know that those resources that we fundraised 2 months ago, they're right now getting to units. So units today are going to have drones flying longer. They're going to have drones flying faster and further because of what you guys stepped up. So in their time of need, you guys are already there for them, but the fighting is not going to stop. Russia's not going to stop. And I know we're not going to stop either. So the latest fundraiser is, of course, energize the front line, generators and power stations. That's what this is about. In the cold winter months, actually, the batteries last less long. And so to keep the drones flying as long as they have to, we're working on getting them power stations, eco flows, generators, inverters, diesel generators. And remember, Ukraine Aid Ops is a US 501c3, meaning that there is absolutely tax deductible if you make a donation. It's also the European equivalent. Now, obviously, if you can throw them up $190, you can get either, by the way, a GUR patch, and we're going to take a look at these guys, Marine Infantry patch or the 1st Battalion of the 24th patch. Guys, if you don't have a GUR patch, it is sick. The OWL, right, you guys know, is the reason Ukrainian intelligence, this is their equivalent of like the CIA special activities, the reason they chose an OWL is because the Russian military intelligence symbol is a bat, and owls eat bats. So, okay, I want to talk about where the fault lies with this. First off, Ukraine says the situation is not critical, but there's also video, speaking of the GUR, there's drone video that was released of GUR troops right here landing via Black Hawk in Pokrovsk, literally reportedly just a few hundred meters from Russian positions. And the GUR troops are very elite. But I want you to understand, Ukraine has very few Black Hawk helicopters. And the fact they're willing to risk one literally a few hundred meters from the front line. By the way, if this thing gets hit with an FPV drone, you see one $500 FPV drone is going to absolutely smoke this thing. So they're taking huge risks, deploying their absolute best infantry to try to carve out enough space and time to do this. Look, the Black Hawk literally dropped off and is already on its way out. But understand, you don't deploy your CIA equivalent infantry with your most expensive airframe hundreds of meters from the front line because things are going great. Okay. Now, here is why I'm so upset with Ukrainian high command. First off, is the fact that you may have noticed that this salient has almost been entirely retaken. And remember, this was a symbolic push by Russian forces, right, where essentially they tricked the Ukrainians, right? This was going into the August meeting between Trump and Putin. Putin wanted a big victory on the battlefield. And so the Russians, instead of continuing their encirclement of Pokrovsk, made a right turn in a tactically worthless direction. They turned and went due north. No one expected it, least of all the Ukrainians. And they found was that the front line is actually quite porous and that the Russians were able to advance up to 15 kilometers, right, before digging in and occupying these areas. But there's a problem. You may notice that this whole salient is on the road to nowhere. It's strategically and operationally irrelevant. And yet, the Ukrainians became so fixated on liberating this territory that you could see it's been the focus for the last 2 weeks. But look, this literally isn't encircling anything. In fact, just letting the Russians sit here and like farming them for resources, forcing them to deploy a bunch of troops to this absolutely worthless salient is actually a pretty tactically good idea. So, but instead, Ukraine spent weeks in deploying some of its most valuable resources to retake these villages, to retake this territory for no reason. And while they did so, the Russians closed in on Pokrovsk. So right there, you have to question the decision-making of the people at Ukrainian high command, not at the battalion level, not at the brigade level, not at the group level, but at the very highest strategic level of where is Ukraine going to deploy its very limited offensive capabilities, an area with purely symbolic value, something that even the Russians would admit has no tactical value whatsoever. Well, why do that? And now they find themselves in a crisis in Pokrovsk. But here's the deeper problem. When I was in Ukraine literally 12 months ago, right? We'll take it back. Here we go. November 2024. The word from units was, hey, the Russians are going to push towards Pokrovsk. And they literally were. They were advancing towards Pokrovsk. They thought they were just going to conduct a frontal assault. Their frontal assault failed. And so then they spent the next 12 months. You can see. Look. Well, I'll show you guys. Here. Okay. Here is December 15th, right? Then here is January 15th. Then here is February 15th. Look, it is transparently obvious what the Russians are doing. It is so obvious, month by month. You can't miss it. They're obviously running a flanking maneuver on Pokrovsk. It is not a secret. It is not subtle. It is obvious. Look, this is July, guys. You can tell what's happening. August, look, there it is. So by August, it was obvious that the Pokrovsk-Minerhad encirclement was the real objective. So there is no reason September and October, 60 days later, to sit there and act like we are surprised, like Ukrainian high command is surprised that there is an encirclement occurring in Pokrovsk. Again, it's on the fucking internet, guys. And the problem is that I think this failure is General Syrski's alone, because this has the hallmarks of his decision-making, right? He famously commanded the Battle of Bakhmut, which in 2023 was seen as a ultra-attritional battle. It became kind of a symbolic point, symbolic hold for the Ukrainians. But while symbolically it felt good for the Ukrainians to hold this long defense and to really attrit Russian forces, what actually ended up happening is that the Ukrainian losses in Bakhmut would have been better served on serving in the counteroffensive that followed. And one of the reasons the counteroffensive failed was because the best Ukrainian troops had engaged in a war of attrition in Bakhmut when they would have been better off simply fighting a withdrawal. And the insane part is that, again, you have Syrski rerunning the same playbook. We've already talked about the fact that Syrski, because of his ultra-high attrition strategy, his absolute unwillingness to withdraw from any positions for any reason, has cost thousands of Ukrainian lives. And literally his own brigade commanders have resorted to lying to him, to tell them, listen, like, there aren't infantry. In fact, the brigade commander's decision to lie to Syrski, I think, could be the only thing keeping this from being a total disaster, because it's possible that there aren't actually that many Ukrainian infantry in these positions, because brigade commanders may have said, hey, infantry is deployed in these areas when it's not, right? They might have said, hey, we technically hold these areas because there's one infantryman in a position out there that's not accounted for. So in theory, we still could hold it. So you hope that that's the case. But this is when people talk about in the U.S. military, they talk so much about trust. You have to trust your high command. You have to trust your subordinates, because you have to trust your subordinates when you say, listen, you need to take this hill. And your subordinate goes, I don't have the people. My commander needs to trust that when I say that, I mean it. I don't have a squad in reserve who's enjoying them. I don't go, I can't take it because I don't really want to lose my buddies. Like, you have to trust your subordinates to give an honest assessment of what their units are capable of. And I, as the subordinate, have to trust my commander to sit there and go, hey, man, if he says we got to take this hill, he means it. Because he knows that my squad is at, my platoon's at 25% operational capacity, and he's still sending me out here. It must be because this is important. That mutual trust, once it's broken, the commander doesn't know what his subordinates are really doing, and the subordinates don't really know what their commander's desires are and how important different orders are. It's a broken, it's a Soviet system, but it is fundamentally broken. And here's what I want to point out. There is a very different operational reality in Toretsk, another area that I was in last year. And I spoke to the units operating and commanding the defense of Toretsk. And they said had an absolutely different perspective. Here's a year ago, Toretsk. So you can see the Russian forces have advanced. They've also been attempting a pincer maneuver, but you're not hearing about this situation in Toretsk. The reason is because the Ukrainians said Toretsk is going to fall. Our strategy is to have the Russians take Toretsk. The plan is to force the Russians to fight and fight and fight for every single city block and take massive casualties. And every time they advance, the Ukrainians would literally, sappers, I mean, you can look at video, sappers would blow up key buildings that the Russians could hide in, ensuring that the next advance of Russian infantry was going to be in the open and incurring massive casualties. Yes, Toretsk, undoubtedly going to fall, absolutely did fall, but it didn't matter because the cost to the Russian armed forces was tremendous and the cost to the defensive units was minimized, right? That is a defense in depth. That is a mobile defense. That is a effective strategy, right? And you see, even though the Russians are still trying to conduct this pincer movement around Toretsk, they are far less effective because, again, Ukrainian forces aren't allowing themselves to be pocketed. They're pulling back when necessary. So the fault, again, I place firmly at the feet of Syrskyi. It has the hallmarks of this, and I understand that in some countries, like, criticism of senior leadership like this is not welcome, but this is why an independent press is important. This is why it is an asset, right? Russia doesn't allow people to make videos like this, but Russia has lost millions and millions of troops and has nothing to show for it. And Ukraine, in contrast, has always been willing to pivot, to look to the next thing. So I'm going to keep you guys updated as this goes on. Again, we hope to see this withdrawal effectively. Check the link in the description for the donor box. And be sure, if you comment on the wall, tell them Paul from Combat Vet News sent you. Thanks to GMAC Club, Henry Russier, James Porsche, Peter Fucci, and all of our Lieutenant tier members. And be sure to follow Ukraine Aid Ops on X. You can see all of the deliveries of the gear that we've raised for them. Thanks, guys. See you in the next one. Cheers.